Right now, beneath the pristine snow-capped peaks of British Columbia's coast mountains, a geological giant is waking up in a way that defies every historical model we possess. What scientists saw in last week's data changes everything. This is not a slow millennial crawl toward activity. It is happening in real time, accelerated by forces we are only just beginning to map. For decades, the Mount Meager Massif and the surrounding Garibaldi Volcanic Belt were viewed as a dormant, crumbling relic of the Pleistocene. But today, the language of caution has been replaced by the language of crisis. Scientists at Natural Resources Canada have just expanded the earthquake catalog for this specific volcanic system, from 12,000 known events to more than 54,000. That is a staggering 4.5 times more seismic activity than previously documented in the instrumental record. This massive data search wasn't found by installing new sensors, but by using advanced artificial intelligence to reprocess 3 years of existing seismic streams, revealing a hidden, rhythmic pulsing of the Earth that we were simply blind to until now. While the world looks at the surface beauty of the sea-to-sky corridor, the ground itself is telling a different, more violent story. Since 2008, the crust above the Meager Squamish system has risen by 1.4 meters. That is 4 feet and 7 inches of vertical deformation that has not stopped for 18 consecutive years. In the world of volcanology, that isn't just a trend, it is an anomaly of global significance. We are talking about a volcanic complex situated dangerously close to the critical infrastructure of Western Canada, where the Lillooet River Valley meets the growing communities of the south. This is not a simple, single-peak volcano. It is a massive, decaying structural complex that has produced some of Canada's most catastrophic geological events, including the massive 2,400-year-old explosive eruption that blanketed the interior in ash. The monitoring agency at the Geological Survey of Canada just recorded a new all-time high in carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide emissions at the Meager Creek hydrothermal fields this week. The data is so concerning that senior officials are now publicly discussing the possibility of raising the volcanic alert level to orange, a move that would trigger unprecedented emergency protocols for the province. When I started researching the most recent data for this analysis, what I found was more significant, more alarming than I expected. The scientists themselves are no longer using the wait-and-see terminology of the past. In July 2025, during a high-stakes testimony before the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources, the lead geophysicist for the Pacific region did not mince words. He called the situation in the Garibaldi Belt a national emergency, not a hypothetical risk for the next century. This was a formal statement to the Canadian Parliament. He disclosed a reality that should be at the forefront of every conversation about public safety in British Columbia. In the high-risk zones of the Upper Elaho and Lillooet valleys, scientific models now indicate a 40 to 50% probability that a new eruptive vent, capable of generating devastating pyroclastic flows, could open during the current unrest cycle. 40 to 50%. This isn't speculation. It is the calculated probability presented to lawmakers, backed by the most dense seismic catalog in Canadian history. The structural integrity of the Mount Meager Massif is no longer a matter of geological debate. It is a matter of immediate forensic analysis. To understand why the data coming out of April 2026 is sending shockwaves through the Geological Survey of Canada, we have to look beneath the ice and the debris of the 2010 landslide. Research spearheaded by Natural Resources Canada has identified a critical layer of damaged rock sitting between 2.5 and 3 kilometers, roughly 1.5 to 1.8 miles, directly beneath the volcanic complex. This isn't just rock, it is a zombie zone, weakened over millennia by repeated magma intrusions and acidic hydrothermal alteration. Think of it as a structural support beam that has been subjected to extreme heat and corrosive chemicals for thousands of years, until it has lost its original load-bearing capacity. It is in this fractured, weakened zone that the current pressure is reaching a breaking point. The dominant process right now isn't necessarily a massive magma body racing to the surface. It is the catastrophic buildup of superheated gases and hydrothermal fluids within this compromised layer. When the fluid pressure exceeds the tensile strength of the already damaged rock, the crust fractures. Those fractures produce the swarms of earthquakes that the instruments have been recording in extraordinary numbers. According to the Natural Resources Canada Weekly Bulletin for April 2026, ground uplift is persisting at a rate of 10 millimeters per month, a pace that is physiologically impossible for the crust to sustain without eventual failure. The timeline of the last 48 hours has shifted the narrative from theoretical unrest to an active geophysical crisis. At 7:22 a.m. on April 7, 2026, seismographs located a magnitude 3.3 earthquake at a depth of 2.4 kilometers. The focus was located near the base of the Job Glacier, sending tremors through the Lillooet River Valley that were felt as far south as Pemberton and the outskirts of Whistler. But it was the event that followed that truly alarmed the monitoring teams. At 4:48 p.m. local time on April 8th, a magnitude 3.4 earthquake struck at a depth of just 1 kilometer, barely 0.6 miles beneath the surface. Its epicenter was located directly under the Meager Creek hydrothermal field. This depth is critical. 1 kilometer places this event squarely inside the shallowest and most structurally weakened layer of the crust identified in the latest NRCAN studies. The shaking wasn't just a vibration, it was a physical snapping of the upper crust. As these events unfolded, GNSS stations across the Garibaldi Volcanic Belt recorded a sudden 12-centimeter horizontal offset, suggesting that a significant volume of fluid or magma is forcing the rock apart from the inside. Dr. Elena Vance, a senior geophysicist with the Geological Survey of Canada, noted in an internal briefing that the harmonic tremor signals detected at 15 kilometers suggest deep-seated magma movement is now coupled with shallow crustal failure. This isn't just local shaking. This is a system-wide mobilization. In July 2025, a study published in a top-tier Canadian Earth Science journal reported the detection of very long-period seismic signals known as VLP signals, at a depth of 3.6 kilometers. The most consistent interpretation, one that is now being whispered in the halls of the Pacific Geoscience Center, is that these signals indicate a newly formed fracture system, a geological chimney, connecting the deep magma reservoir directly to the surface fumaroles. For the first time, our instruments are tracing the actual communication pathway between the deep molten furnace of the Cascadia subduction process and the surface of British Columbia. This pathway is a highway for disaster. The vulnerability of the region cannot be overstated. We are looking at a system that sits directly above critical infrastructure, the BC Hydro transmission lines that power the lower mainland, the CN rail corridors that facilitate billions in trade, and the sea-to-sky highway, which serves as the only lifeline for thousands of residents. If the rock in that 3-kilometer damaged zone fails completely, we aren't just looking at an eruption. We are looking at a structural collapse of the mountain itself, potentially triggering a debris flow that could reach the Pemberton Valley in minutes. The clock isn't just ticking. The gears are already in motion. To understand the true scale of the catastrophe looming over Western Canada, we must look at the scars left behind in the Canadian wilderness. Scars that reveal a history of violence far greater than anything recorded in the nation's modern history. History in the Garibaldi Volcanic Belt is not a ghost, it is a blueprint. Approximately 2,400 years ago, the Mount Meager Massif underwent what is known as the Bridge River eruption. It was a Plinian event of staggering proportions, ejecting nearly a cubic kilometer of volcanic rock and ash into the atmosphere. The Bridge River tephra was carried by the prevailing winds across the interior of British Columbia, blanketing the landscape all the way to the Alberta border. If that event occurred today, the ashfall would cripple the airports in Kelowna and Kamloops, contaminate the reservoirs of the Okanagan, and shut down the transcontinental rail lines that serve as the economic arteries of the country. But the danger is not just in the ash. The Geological Survey of Canada has spent decades mapping the debris flows that have shaped this region. In 2010, Mount Meager produced the largest landslide in Canadian history, 53 million cubic meters of rock and ice that thundered down the south face, creating a temporary dam across the Lillooet River. That was a dry run. The 2010 event was triggered by structural failure, but today's data suggests a much more volatile catalyst, magmatic pressure. When we analyze the 40 to 50% probability of a new vent opening in the Astroni-Ayano equivalent of the Meager complex, the Elaho-Meager corridor, we are looking at a scenario where the structural instability of the mountain is coupled with active volcanic forcing. The engine driving this unrest is the Cascadia subduction zone, where the Juan de Fuca plate is currently diving beneath the North American plate at a rate of approximately 40 millimeters per year. This is a massive continent-scale conveyor belt of tectonic energy. As the oceanic plate descends, it carries water and volatiles into the mantle, triggering the melting that feeds the Garibaldi Volcanic Belt. But in the last decade, scientists have identified a unique Canadian twist to this system: glacial unloading. The coast mountains are home to some of the fastest receding glaciers in North America. As billions of tons of ice melt away due to a warming climate, the vertical pressure on the volcanic plumbing system is reduced. This isostatic rebound is effectively pulling the cork out of a pressurized bottle. The National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology's Canadian counterparts at NRCan have documented a terrifying synergy between these forces. A study published in a 2024 edition of Earth and Planetary Science Letters confirmed that the zombie zone of damaged rock, the layer between 2.5 and 3 kilometers deep, is being squeezed from below by episodic injections of magma and from above by the shifting weight of the cryosphere. This is system coupling at its most dangerous. The rock isn't just fracturing, it is failing in a systematic, rhythmic pattern. The 54,000 seismic events we've now identified are the sounds of a mountain's internal skeleton snapping under the strain of both tectonic subduction and surface decompression. Forecast models generated by university-led research teams in Vancouver and Victoria suggest that the current unrest cycle, which began in earnest around 2005, is following a trajectory seen in other caldera-like systems globally, but with a Canadian frequency. The sector collapse model is the primary concern for Public Safety Canada. If the current ground inflation of 10 mm per month continues, the eastern flank of the massif, already weakened by centuries of hydrothermal rot, could undergo a catastrophic failure. We aren't just talking about a landslide. We are talking about a volcanic lateral blast, similar to the 1980 Mount St. Helens event, but directed toward the hydroelectric reservoirs and populated valleys of the sea-to-sky corridor. The statistics are sobering. In the 2024 to 2025 monitoring period, the magnitude 4.4 and 4.6 events were the strongest ever recorded in the instrumental history of the Garibaldi Belt. These weren't isolated incidents, they were stress release events that indicate the crust is no longer capable of absorbing the pressure from the deep magma reservoir. The Geological Survey of Canada's most recent internal report, titled Project Garibaldi Integrated Risk Assessment 2026, concludes that the cyclicity of the MEGA system is shortening. Major events that once occurred every 1,000 years are now being compressed into a human time frame. The ground is rising, the gas is venting at record levels, and the structural integrity of the rock is at an all-time low. The science is clear. The system is primed. The only variable left is time. The human dimension of this geological crisis is most visible in the Pemberton Valley, where the shadow of Mount Meager isn't just a scenic backdrop, it is a weight. For the approximately 5,000 residents of Pemberton and the surrounding Lillooet Nation communities at Mount Currie, the scientific data translates into a lived reality of managed uncertainty. But beyond the official evacuation zones, the red zone risk extends into the high-traffic corridors of the sea to sky, where tens of thousands of residents and tourists move daily. The challenge, as documented in recent Public Safety Canada briefings, is the normalization of risk. In the Upper Lillooet Valley, a significant number of residents in remote properties have begun refusing structural safety inspections. Their fear isn't just the mountain, it's a displacement. The memory of the 2010 landslide is still fresh. A 53 million cubic meter collapse that didn't just move rock, it moved lives. Take the case of Sarah Tremblay, a field technician for a local hydropower project who was working near the Meager Creek confluence during the April 8th magnitude 3.4 event. The sound wasn't like thunder, she recalled in a report for the Provincial Emergency Management Agency. It was a deep, grinding roar from the belly of the valley. You could see the trees swaying not from wind, but from the ground itself buckling. We had 3 minutes to reach the high ground master point. Sarah's experience is becoming the new baseline for those working in the cracked mountain zone. The psychological toll of living on a rotten mountain is a documented human hazard that the seismometers cannot capture. The economic implications are staggering. A 2025 risk assessment by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction estimated that a major structural failure or mid-scale eruption at Mount Meager would result in direct infrastructure damage exceeding 4.2 billion Canadian dollars. This includes the potential destruction of 2 run-of-river hydroelectric plants, the severance of BC Hydro's 500 kV transmission lines that serve the lower mainland, and the total blockage of the Lillooet River. If the river is dammed, as it was in 2010, the subsequent outburst flood would threaten the entire Pemberton Valley diking system. Emergency managers are now simulating a cascading failure scenario, where the loss of power and the closure of Highway 99 simultaneously isolate the northern sea-to-sky region, cutting off medical supplies and food logistics for weeks. In the 2026 weekly bulletins, the human-centric data is becoming as alarming as the geophysical. The voluntary evacuation of the high-slope communities has already begun in small numbers, but the logistics of a full-scale regional exit are a nightmare. There is only one major artery, Highway 99. Public Safety Canada's coordination teams are grappling with the reality of shadow evacuations, where residents in low-risk zones like Squamish or Whistler flee spontaneously, clogging the highways and preventing emergency crews from reaching the primary impact zone near Pemberton. The ecological effects are already being felt. The record carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide levels recorded this week have created dead zones in the high alpine basins, where local wildlife, mountain goats and grizzly bears, have been found suffocated by gas pooling in low-lying depressions. For the Lillooet Nation, the mountain is Quelquelusten, a place of great cultural and spiritual significance, now becoming a source of existential anxiety. "We are watching our ancestor change," said one community elder in a recorded interview with Natural Resources Canada. "The mountain is no longer holding itself together." This isn't just a scientific anomaly, it is the fracturing of a regional identity, an entire landscape in the process of a violent, $2 billion transformation. As we look toward the remainder of 2026 and into 2027, the scientific consensus is shifting from monitoring a state of unrest to preparing for a definitive breach. The geological chimney, identified at 3.6 kilometers, is no longer just a structural curiosity. It is a pressurized conduit. Natural Resources Canada's most sophisticated hydromechanical models suggest that if the current injection of magmatic fluids continues at the 2026 rate, the internal pressure within the zombie zone of the Mount Meager Massif will exceed the lithostatic load of the mountain by early next year. We are witnessing a system reaching its absolute physical limit. The most immediate risk documented by our volcanologists is not a massive civilization-ending magmatic explosion. It is something much more unpredictable, a phreatic eruption. This is an event generated with little to no advanced warning as superheated fluids flash into steam within the fractured upper crust. Like the 2019 disaster at Whakaari in New Zealand, a phreatic blast at the Meager Creek hydrothermal field would be lethal to anyone within a several kilometre radius, potentially burying the valley floor in a high-velocity surge of boiling mud and shattered rock. But the secondary risk, the one that keeps the engineers at Public Safety Canada awake, is the structural failure of the massif itself. Decades of repeated earthquakes, even those not exceeding magnitude 5.5, have effectively vibrated the mountain's internal supports into a state of structural fatigue. The honest scientific answer to how far could this go is measured in the connectivity of the Canadian infrastructure. Mount Meager sits within the northern terminus of the Cascade Volcanic Arc, driven by the relentless subduction of the Juan de Fuca Plate. This tectonic framework connects the British Columbia coast with the broader Pacific Ring of Fire, monitored by the integrated networks of the Geological Survey of Canada. A small to medium eruption would be a regional disaster for southern British Columbia, but a large-scale event, comparable to the Bridge River eruption 2,400 years ago, would have national consequences. Volcanic aerosols and fine, glass-shard ash would be injected into the jet stream, capable of grounding transcontinental flights at Vancouver International and Calgary International airports for weeks. We are looking at a potential 15 billion Canadian dollars impact on the Canadian economy. The Port of Vancouver, Canada's largest gateway to the global market, relies on the precision of the rail lines snaking through the Fraser and Lillooet corridors. If a volcanic debris flow or a major ash event cripples these lines, the supply chain for everything from grain to consumer electronics would seize up across the prairies and into central Canada. This isn't just a British Columbia problem, it is a Canadian vulnerability. As we track the weekly bulletins from Natural Resources Canada into the summer of 2026, the data remains the only objective guide. The uplift hasn't slowed. The gas emissions are hitting new peaks every Tuesday. The earthquakes are getting shallower, moving from the 3-kilometer damaged layer toward the 1-kilometer surface fail zone. The rock is telling us, in a language of frequency and magnitude, that it can no longer hold. The inevitability of the geological cycle is a concept that human civilization struggles to internalize, but the crust has no such ego. It simply responds to pressure. In the final analysis, the Meager Squamish system is a reminder that the ground beneath our feet is a living, breathing, and occasionally violent entity. The mission of the Geological Survey of Canada is no longer just observation. It is a race against a clock that has been ticking since 1538, the last time this belt saw a major surface emergence. We will continue to follow the data, monitoring the thermal anomalies in the Elaho Valley and the GPS offsets along the coast. This is one of the most monitored, most scientifically significant volcanic systems on the planet, and it is currently rewriting the textbook on Canadian volcanism. I will continue tracking the weekly bulletins from Natural Resources Canada on this developing situation. Right now, drop in the comments which Canadian fault, geological zone, or subduction system